right, well, let's kick things off. Hello, everybody. My name is Jesus J. Montero. I am double dipping for today's session. Along with being these two awesome, badass panelists, I will be your host with the most and leading today's discussion and facilitating questions and also just moving things along. I can't hear an echo from that. Oh, thank you so much, Amy. I can, and when you hear yourself back, it's very cringy. So that's why my face is kind of. But before I ask the panelists to introduce themselves, just give a quick layout on today's session. We're each going to take some time to talk about our projects, our investigations, some of the other work within our newsrooms. During that time, if you get some burning questions, please put them in the chat. We'll try our best to address them. We also have some time at the end to share for additional questions and or tips. So again, this is going to be a very back and forth dialogue between our panel and hopefully a lot of you people in the chat. So let's allow me to reintroduce myself. My name is Jesus J. Montero. I am a community reporter with Cicero Independiente. It is a newsroom, POC, run and led by the good folks in the town of Cicero, all community-based. They saw a need for, within the news desert, within Cicero, which is a western suburb of mainly Latinx people. And in its short time, it's produced a lot of great investigations looking into the quality of life and also important issues and topics that have come up during the pandemic and civil unrest that occurred last summer. I'm gonna kick it off to Diane to see if she could do her intros and give a little bit about herself and her work. But before that, curveball question. Along with the intros, if you can give the good people at FOIA Fest, like what's something that you do when you're like, you got writer's block, there's a deadline coming up, what's something that you personally can do as a reporter, as a journalist, as somebody that, you know, is in this space that like clears your mind and your palate? For me, it's like walking, exploring nature, a good drink. This is Topo Chico. Do not get it twisted. I know FOIA as the after parties are at the bars, but for right now we're on duty. But what's something that you like to do or that helps you when you're in that space?
Well, I'll start off by answering that question. I sit in my place almost more than 10 hours a day between studying and working, so it's definitely getting out of or away from my desk, away from technology, and just thinking about the purpose of my story and just relying on where my thoughts lead me is how I regain that creativity if I have writer's block. That's a great question, too. So hello, everyone. Hello, panelists. My name is Diane Bou Kalil. I'm the engagement reporter for Borderless Magazine. We're a nonprofit news outlet in Chicago. We cover immigration in Chicago and in the Midwest, and we focus on labor, justice, advocacy issues impacting the immigrant communities. And we write those stories through a lens of equity and resilience. A little bit about myself. I'm Lebanese. I have an immigrant background. I'm first gen, but I was raised in Lebanon, now based in Chicago, and I'm in grad school for international studies at DePaul, and my focus is on immigration and Middle East social history. And with Chicago having a huge immigrant population, I find that it's really my passion to report on these communities.
Lord, thank you. All right, one of the nicest editors in Chicago, Alden.
Hey, thanks, Jesus. Good to be with you. Good to be with you as well, Diane. I'm Alden Loury. I'm the senior editor of Race, Class, and Communities at WBEZ, which is the the Chicago member station of NPR. In my role, I am leading a team of three fantastic reporters on the Race, Class, and Communities desk. They are providing beat coverage of housing, immigration, and work and opportunity. And as a team, we are providing broader enterprise coverage of issues related to race and inequality. And that goes from everything from, reporting on demographic shifts to issues of racial equity and or inequity and how it's being handled by local governments, to covering race-related matters that spark the aftermath of the Derek Chauvin verdict, the anti-Asian hate that was witnessed during the pandemic, things of that nature. We like to think about the desk providing deeper, meaningful coverage around perplexing issues related to race. How should people process, difficult conversations that we're having around race, and also highlighting issues of inequality that may not be visible to the naked eye, if you will. And so we rely a fair amount on data and a fair amount on FOIA to help suss out inequities as it's happening. So that has always been my passion, data reporting and reporting on issues related to race and inequality for the past 20 years or so. No matter what post I've been in, I've always thought of my work as being that work. So glad to be with you, and thanks for tuning into FOIA Fest this year.
Yeah, beautiful work indeed. But Alden, if you could share what.
Yeah. So for me, usually it's similar to what Diane mentioned. It's just kind of getting away from the computer, getting away from a screen, and kind of getting connected with the surroundings. And usually what works best for me is something that's peaceful, but engaging. So it's like I can clear my mind of what I'm stuck on, but my mind is active. So I'm I try to walk through a park or something where I see people, where I hear things. And I think it's just something about my mind getting an opportunity to take in things and process, but something completely different and something that is relatively, not in your face, but it's engaging enough that it's got the synapses working. And that usually tends to trigger something. So, the lead I was looking for, or I'm trying to figure out how to, segment, a very complex story. Usually I'll get some kind of idea or notion that helps kind of push me through whatever I'm blocked on, and I can go back and try to work it out from there. So.
That's beautifully said. I think given the nature of this panel too, like FOIA during the pandemic, like I think to be clear and 100%, like the pandemic was hard for everybody. It just didn't affect data, it didn't affect government offices and response times for FOIAs. I think the biggest thing it affected was ourselves. So nice for both of you for sharing what you shared, and I feel like a lot of people on this in this panel and group and at FOIA Fest have found out the hard way the best thing to do when they're in that space. But Dan, we're gonna start off with you. I'm gonna go ahead and throw your slide up, and if you can get started with that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Hi again, everyone. So the story that I am going to be talking about today is a story on the food restaurant businesses during spring 2021. And as we saw, as an immigration news outlet, at first, we always report on food because immigrants always get food with them, their culture. And so if you look at Chicago's food scene as well, it's represented in our city already. So many diverse food restaurants around us. And so also with immigration reporting, a lot of those people behind the restaurants are immigrant entrepreneurs and family businesses. And so once the pandemic hit, we saw, as immigration reporters, we saw this like huge pattern that businesses were in big crisis. And so in March 2020, I went around my neighborhood when I was living in Westridge, and I went to the local restaurants that I used to go to on the weekends before the pandemic. And I went in, and this Lebanese restaurant on Devon and McCormick called Libanais, it was like covered in plastic. All of the staff were gone at that time, and it was just the owner of the restaurant. And so seeing that huge change was, very hurtful for the owner and for the community, all communities as well. Like, it was a huge drop of revenue. And then I went to other restaurants in other stories throughout summer 2020 of businesses opening, businesses closing. And so there was this like fluctuating pattern of either businesses really suffering or flourishing. And so by spring 2021, things were also changing. Like, we didn't know what was going on still. Policies were changing every day. Mandates were changing. The vaccine was finally becoming like common to get in spring. And so, and also I signed up for the FOIA boot camp, which helped with this story. My mentor was actually Adriana Gallardo. And I thought of the idea of doing a series on like a lot of restaurants in Chicago and kind of investigating what's going on. I didn't know what the conclusion was going to be, but I wanted to know what was going on. So we looked at the Chicago Hospitality Grant, which was announced in November 2020, that was going to give $10,000 to 1,000 restaurants. And so I FOIA'd the city of Chicago, the Business Affairs and Consumer Protection Institution, and I wanted to know who are the people that applied to the grant, who are the people that got accepted, who got denied, how many languages were these applications and grants offered in to communicate with different immigrant communities. And I wanted to know, for those people who got accepted to the grant, what zip codes, what neighborhoods. I just wanted to know details. And we found out a lot. We ended up starting with like 1,000 restaurants and then narrowing it down to 20 restaurants. And of course, I'll explain later in the conversation what we found. But it was really interesting to get to know who is behind those restaurants, and also the statistics from the FOIA. So I requested FOIA, I requested data, but then because of that data came out this really humane story of immigrant entrepreneurs really suffering during the pandemic and not knowing what the future was going to hold, especially that it was before summer. They didn't know what wave was going to come back, what new virus is going to come, new variant was going to come back. So it was one of my favorite stories that I ever reported.
Yeah, thanks for that. And you mentioned how FOIA was able to assist your reporting, right? And it was able to connect you with actual physical people, right? Would you say that was the biggest takeaway that you got with working with FOIAs, was that connection between the story, which is very data driven, to that human element?
Yeah. So once I got, so I filed FOIA. I remember in February, I was writing up the letter and the FOIA stuff in February 21. I filed February 24, 2021, and then around March 7th, March 9th, I got feedback and I got all the data. So luckily it was a bit faster. I did have to follow up many times with the FOIA officer, but once I got my hands on that data, it was a lot of data, like almost over 2,000 restaurants applied. And so I was navigating like what to do with that FOIA information. And so usually you like to socialize and interview people before you get maybe hands-on data, but I wasn't able to do that until I saw who was behind the restaurants and what restaurants I wanted to choose. And so I definitely FOIA helped me kind of choose the people I needed to speak to, and I ended up talking to, the whole story was almost like over 50 restaurants, and then to those who like responded and were consistent, it ended up being 20 stories.
For the new people that are joining in, we're each taking the time to talk about our investigations, talking about our newsrooms, any other relevant information regarding FOIA during the pandemic. And Diane just shared how FOIA was able to connect her with actual real people, which is an element that you were needing to help tell this very human-centered story revolving around Chicago restaurants. Was there any like limitations or any other obstacles pertaining to like gathering all this time? I mean, gathering all this data, like you mentioned, time before was time a factor in completing this investigation?
Yeah. So first, I think one of the things that you have to think about when you get all this data is the coding. So I had to sit down and think like, okay, I have almost like 3,000 restaurants, and, you know, working with all these Excel sheets, how am I going to separate it? So I separated it by first looking at the restaurants and seeing what type of food they sell and they make, whether Middle Eastern, Mexican, whatever it is. And then I organized it by zip code. I organized it by neighborhood. I organized it by food type. And then I had to call all of them to see which one was immigrant owned or not. Did a lot of Googling, a lot of researching. And then it came down to those few restaurants that I ended up sticking with. And then also, so the coding part, and then also time. So again, as I mentioned, during the pandemic, like every month, every week, there's some sort of new news going on, whether the CDC is updating us or whether certain governors or mayors or city officials. And so I filed the FOIA in February where, you know, we were still locked down. We were still not knowing what's going on. And then the story ended up coming out in July, and a lot happened since February to July. Like we got vaccines. I think the mask mandate was also fluctuating. And so just the time, and you have to keep in mind that things are always changing. So maybe the story that you have in the beginning is going to change towards the end, or the narrative will change towards the end, depending on what you keep finding.
Alden, in your experience as a really great editor at WBZ, do you agree like sometimes data changes, story changes, things are always changing?
Yeah, you know, data can be a great resource, but it can also be complicating because you know, you have to pick a point in time where you're going to grab that data, and yeah, maybe things are going to fluctuate. Maybe the data doesn't line up, you know, precisely with what you're hearing in your reporting. You know, the data can kind of tell its own story, and then, you know, not all data is created equal. You know, some of the data can be problematic. And you look through it enough, you may find inconsistencies, you may have other questions. And then you also have to be careful about how you interpret the data. And so, you know, you have to be in close contact with the source of the data. Because sometimes the data is coming from an admin, a bureaucrat who's retrieved it, but they don't know very much about exactly what the data is meant to tell you. And so that person has to be a go-between between you and whatever, you know, professional at the government agency where the data came from, who may know that data intimately well. It's also helpful to be plugged in with other folks who work with that data, who can also kind of help decipher things for you. So data is great, and I'm going to talk about you know, in terms of tips, that it's something that people should definitely use, but it's something that has to be used with care. And then you also have to be skeptical of the information that you get to make sure that it's telling you what you think it's telling you.
That's just, I mean, so true. Dan, back to you. During this time, and of course this was all during the pandemic, right? So like, what was your day-to-day life? You mentioned you're still in school, you know, like trying to like paint a picture for everybody of how long it took you and like what you were trying to do besides working on this investigation.
Well, besides working on that investigation, I was also doing other stories for Borderless and going on the streets, engaging with the community. If there was a demonstration or anything, that the immigrant community was protesting or any activism, I was covering it. I was tabling at events, also with school. So for sure, FOIA is not the only thing that people are focused on in life. I know, data is really, it can be it can be heavy. So I definitely feel like when you have to be patient with FOIA, and also when you receive that data, like take it day to day, day by day. Don't think you can conclude something just overnight.
Okay. Agreed. I know we got some time at the end to say for tips and questions, but Alden or anybody else on the panel, if somebody's speaking and something comes up, definitely share it, interrupt, put that in the chat. But I'm gonna go next. If you could put my slide up there. Sorry for earlier. There's a lot of confusion. This new software system. It's pretty cool though. So I am a community reporter with Cicero Independiente, but I also freelance full time. They don't have anybody on staff just quite yet. So being from Cicero, I remember when the newsroom was first created and started. I was excited because Cicero was a news desert, and growing up, there was no representation or no news source within the town. So being a part of the newsroom is probably my greatest journalism honor. Let me go a slide back. There it is. Perfect. So, in partnership with Muck Rock and the Pulitzer Center, we took a look at COVID relief spending within the town of Cicero. Cicero received the most than any other municipalities, and within our investigation, what we discovered is Cicero spent the total allocation of more than $1 million on police officers' regular salaries. If you can go to the next slide. There's a lot of info there, but we'll start off with some of the findings. There you see the number, over a milli. In Cicero, all funds were used to pay the regular salaries of at least 23 officers of the town's 147 police officers between April and September 2020. Cicero's police budget is over $30 million, so they had more than enough money and then some and some change to be spending on police officer salaries. Despite our many questions and many attempts, it was unclear whether those police were involved in any COVID relief efforts. And throughout this and throughout the tips, I'll talk about my experience and the experience that other people within the Cicero Independiente newsroom have with FOIA and just things that go along with that. And regarding to FOIA, for this specific story, I FOIA'd both local and state offices. And both had their own limitations and when it came to answering back, right? Especially during the pandemic. Pandemic hours really created a backlog of time and things to get done for this investigation. To give some context, I think the investigation lasted probably 4 or 5 months. And during that time, I was living in Cicero at the time, but I moved to New York just to try to get away and try to do something different. So going back and forth between the town that I grew up in and trying to do something new, it was very challenging. And on top of that, the pandemic. A lot of these offices were closed, so it created some time between actually getting the FOIA in to actually getting an answer, right? And that's very problematic, especially when it comes to, talking things out with your editor, planning things with the graphic designer, making sure things are great for the rollout, making sure the edits are good. So that time really caused problems. But focusing on FOIA, as cliche as it sounds, I put $. I think the biggest break in the investigation was following the money. And I think another big takeaway that we have done with this investigation, but also other investigations, is we posted the FOIA along with the story. I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat. Diane, I forgot to put yours. I'm so sorry. But I think that that transparency is, I think, something that a lot of journalism newsrooms should more focus on, instead of like gatekeeping information, but also being transparent on how um, these sources and this data is collected. And I'll share the impact, how that had a positive impact within the community. I think the biggest roadblocks is I put doomsday scrolling data. So when I first applied for, when I first filed my FOIA, the town like gave me everything in the kitchen sink, right? They gave me a PDF of what they thought I was looking for, right? So I asked for, what was this money spent on? And they sent me screenshots of Facebook postings of the town giving away foods, screenshots of people passing out PPE supplies, and it was just like a huge PDF, right? I would show it on screen, but y'all would get bored in like 2 seconds because it was long and just full of screenshots. But that's not what I was asking for, right? So what I did, going back to the cliche of following the money, on one of the applications I saw, in order to reclaim the money that your town receives, you have to send a receipt, right? All right, let's see where this receipt can lead. So then I filed communications between the receipt emails and the town of Cicero, and then that unveiled the treasure trove of what officers received the funding, during which time period. So it was just paying attention to the droves and dozens of files that they were trying to bury me with, right? But as FOIA's requests were increasing, time was also running out. I think we all have like the experience of like having our head in the computer trying to figure things out, but looking at all this data is cool. There's a lot of good info, a lot of great stories, but um, it's going to take a long time. It's going to take some time to get this investigation out. I think another roadblock is the prolonged office hours, which resulted in prolonged answers. Because this was the pandemic, a lot of these places didn't have people, a lot of these local offices, not just within Cicero. I was FOIAing and talking with the Illinois Treasury Department since they were in charge of handing out the funding, right? And paying attention to that kind of stuff. Who's in the office during what time, during what hours. It definitely kicked the can down the road, and picking up stuff that I should have been working on that week to next week. So again, that's why the investigation took about 5 months. Impact, I think, is important to mention for the story, because we put the FOIAs in the story. Community groups within Cicero took that data and they did their own survey. They took that data, they took our original reporting, and they interviewed close to 400 residents and asked them questions like, well, what would you have spent the money on, right? And I think that's important because it kicked them into action, kind of, and I thought that was pretty cool. There was also protests, which was nice. And the town's official answer, or their response to the reporting, was you remember I talked about those screenshots? They posted a few of those on a news article, and their answers to the story was, obviously people with outside agendas have sought to politicize and distort these facts for their own personal advantage. So, but we had the receipts, we had the PDF within our story, and we were able to do that with this story. I do have some tips and tricks that I think a lot of people should try to take from this, from my example. But Alden, I wanted to ask you, when you get hit with a whole bunch of data like they did with me, like what's something that you do to like comb through all that noise to find the needle in the haystack? And what's something that you've done or that you did during the pandemic that like helped with that?
Sure. I'm always excited to get whatever we can get, right? So even if it's and there are times when folks will try to make things challenging for you, so they'll try to overwhelm you, or they'll give you something in a form that's difficult to work with. But um, uh, I mean, usually I try to be very pointed with the data. There are times when you may ask for something and you want to explore, but even in those situations, I try to think of very clear questions that I have of the data. I think of the data as a source, and sometimes I'll even write down, 5, 10, 15 questions that I want to ask of the data. What am I curious about? And I'll spend some time trying to kind of digest what I'm looking at. So I'll look at all the fields, I'll review the records, and try to get an understanding, look through the record layout if they've provided one, and try to get an understanding of what's here, what does this encompass? And then based upon what I know is part of the universe, start asking questions that I think I can glean from that. And usually we'll try to identify the questions that are top of mind, that are key to whatever it is that we're investigating, and then looking at those fields and saying, okay, I think this tells me what I'm looking for. So let me look for these specific things in here, and try to come away with some top level findings, if you will, based on that. But a lot of times it's really just looking through the information, and there will be things that will appear. Oh, I didn't even know this was here. It's a field or something, and that might spark some additional questions that you might want to ask of the data. So just spending some time with it, and kind of like Diane was saying, take your time, pace yourself. But when you've got a ton of information, it could be a hassle and maybe time consuming on some level. But ultimately, I would say if the data is accessible, and it doesn't have any glaring errors in it, that's actually a benefit to have, more is more, as they might say. There may be something in there that you weren't expecting that could be useful to you. Like I said, the key is just having it in a form where you can actually do something with. So if somebody sends you, 1,000 PDFs, that are not searchable, then that can be cumbersome. And if that's the only way you can get the info, then you may have to be, whether you're using some kind of, optical recognition, character recognition, or something like that, you may have to work a little harder to pull out of it what you can. But anything you get is a step in the right direction, even if it's in a challenging form.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think this also kind of circles back to like having so much information, right? And for this panel specifically, it was included in the description, like FOIA during the pandemic and during unrest. With the Cicero Independiente newsroom, we did a project looking at the unrest that occurred within Cicero and the results of that. Over 60 people arrested, 2 people murdered, dozens of businesses were looted and attacked. But also, more importantly, there was racial tensions between Black residents and Latinx residents. But for that story with FOIAs, we really relied on FOIAs because there was only 3 reporters for the whole town, and trying to cover a little bit of everything was very difficult. So when we relied on FOIA to cover the unrest, we gathered that data and we analyzed it to try to see where we could fit in those missing puzzles of the story. So it's like too much is a good thing, but also having the data where you can like analyze it is also very, very important. I'll drop that in the chat too. For those that are just tuning in, remember we're each doing a little segment about our stories. Alden, you're up next. If you do have any questions, put them in the chat. We'll try to get to them as we can. Otherwise, we're saving them to the end. Alden, I'm gonna put your screen up on top.
Sure. Thanks, Jesus. So I'm going to talk about a story that we wrapped up we published in November. We spent it's dubbed Drowning in Debt. This was by Maria Zamudio, our immigration reporter, who came to WBEZ from APM Reports, where she had worked on a kind of multi-city look at, I think it was 6 Great Lakes cities, and she was looking at water debt. I'm sorry, she was looking at water shutoffs and the cost of water in those 6 cities. Chicago was one of them, and when she joined BEZ in the fall of 2018. She brought that story with her, and we did a Chicago slice of it for WBEZ, so essentially documenting 150,000 water shutoffs, primarily in Black and Latino neighborhoods in Chicago, low-income communities in Chicago over a 10-year period, and that the cost of water over that time had actually tripled. And so she'd wanted to do a follow-up, and it took us maybe about a year or so to kind of get clear on doing it, and a couple of years before we actually really got started on it. And so we embarked upon that last year, about the middle of 2021, and that was to take a look at the actual debt that resulted from this rapid increase in the cost of water. And we set aside 4 months to work on this thing, and actually probably took us about 6 months from beginning to end. But what we discovered was, over $400 million in water debt during that 10-year period. And the fact, and that was, our big get. We wanted to kind of get that number. What was the volume of this debt? But what we learned along the way, Maria submitted over 30 FOIAs. And, I think she started out with about 4 or 5 different things that she wanted to look at. And each FOIA revealed something that led to more questions and additional FOIAs. But what I think we ultimately came up with was not just a story of the volume of debt, but actually a very interesting way in which the city has gone about recovering debt. We also learned a great deal about the impact of very key decisions that were made by the Chicago City Council with regard to looking for revenue and leaning on water and sewer bills to go after that revenue. And then some of the backstory that was involved in some of that. And then she also used FOIA to find to tell very specific stories about parts of the process, the administrative hearings process, where people have debt and they essentially go to this little known process that is essentially kind of like a people's court, if you will, to adjudicate debt owed to the city, and what that process looks like, how often people are aware or not aware, as the case is often, and what can happen as a result of that. All things that were not known to us when we embarked upon this, but became apparent as Maria was doing her reporting. And a couple of FOIAs provided information that helped us provide a very clear picture of what that process looked like and what were the consequences of people who went through that process. And then she was also able to tell, with the permission of some key sources that she had met along the way, and people who had anecdotally told her about what had happened to them. And usually that's all you really need, right? But there are details that people leave out, and then FOIAs to actually document literally the kind of a roadmap of their debt, to see each and every bill, to see each and every payment. We were able to piece together exactly how these folks were impacted. These handful of folks for which she did this examination using FOIA to get their records. We were actually able to show very clearly how regular people were impacted by some of these key decisions that were made by government leaders to jack up the price of water and sewer, and how it was impacting these folks. And all of those elements, I think, made for a very comprehensive, thorough, illustrative, and impactful review and analysis of this process. And it was more than just that one number we were going after. It was about, the ways in which a municipality has chosen to kind of make itself whole, but then also acknowledging that, a big part of why this is a problem is because of the choices that were made by the municipality itself. So, we were felt really good about what we came away with, and FOIA was really, really an incredible instrument that helped us tell the story.
What's one of the things you would say that for this huge investigation was probably the biggest factor, especially during the pandemic. Like how did FOIA help assist with this story and bridging all these different elements together?
I'm sorry, Jesus, it was a little hard to hear you there. You were saying, how did FOIA do what now?
Assist with this story. Like how was it? Can you hear me now? How was FOIA being it? Like how did FOIA, especially during the pandemic, help connect all these different elements from the data? Let me actually put it in the chat.
Okay.
If you guys haven't had a chance to actually read it, this story is insane. But if you could walk us through the FOIA process that you've had with the story.
And so it was, like I said, we went in knowing that we wanted to figure out what people ultimately owed. And so I think the initial FOIA was literally for like an accounting of all the different accounts and how much was owed presently to the city, or how much was owed over this 10-year period for each of these accounts. And so we got that information, but there were some holes in that data that we had to go back and figure out a little bit more. And so one of the things that Maria learned in her reporting was that there are some properties where there are water meters, and there are a lot of properties where there are not water meters. And so we wanted to have a sense of which properties had meters and which properties didn't. Our thought process was, let's figure out which of these properties for which we've got data that tells us how much was owed, which of those properties are metered and which aren't. And so one of the challenges that we had was that we had, I would say, maybe 5 or 6 key databases, but we couldn't find a common thread that allowed us for each of those sets of data to talk with one another. So we had a picture of how many properties were metered and unmetered, but we didn't have kind of a common reference point that allowed us to link that data very directly with the data about the amount of debt that was owed. We also had a separate database about people who had gone through the administrative hearings process. And that data, which told its own story, as I was mentioning earlier, we couldn't connect to either of those other 2 sets of data. So that was one of our challenges that we weren't able to overcome, at least to the degree that we had hoped we would be able to get them all to talk with one another. But we thought, even as these piecemeal sets of data still told very similar stories. We still knew that the problems were happening in certain parts of town. We still knew that these problems were exacerbated when, or in the aftermath of the city making decisions. One of the more recent ones was in 2017. The city passed an ordinance adding a water and sewer tax to water and sewer bills in an effort to raise money to pay for the city's underfunded municipal pensions. And we could see both in the individual records of a couple of the people who were key sources, how their debt increased. There was one woman who was literally making routine payments for most of the 10 years that we looked at her records, with the exception of a short period of time when she was out of work. But even though she was making these payments, she was falling farther and farther behind. And we included in the story a graphic that showed it specifically in relation to when this water and sewer tax was passed, how her overall debt leaped in the aftermath of that choice. So her bill went up by, I want to say, maybe like 30, 35%, something like that. And she was paying, but not paying enough each time to essentially to stay current. She kept falling farther and farther behind, but she really fell behind after that decision was made. And so, the decision to submit a FOIA to get her individual records along and pairing that with the other information that we've gotten about the overall debt and these decisions that were made along the way really helped link and offer context to what we were trying to document. But in terms of our plan, initially, like I said, there were a few things that we knew we wanted to go after, and we knew that they were going to be in separate buckets. But once we got that information, we looked through it. Oh, well, we know the administrative hearings process is a part of this thing. Let's figure out what that data looks like. Oh, we know Carla Pageant was one of the sources in our story. Maria's been talking with her and has heard some very interesting things, and she talks about how she just keeps falling farther and farther behind. Well, let's actually get her records and let's see what those things look like. We know the city council passed a law around this water and sewer tax. Well, let's figure out how much money has actually been generated by that tax, and where it's actually going. And so that led to another FOIA to try to figure that out. We knew the city, at least at one time, was issuing statutory liens or statutory judgments in the adjudication of these cases in the administrative hearings process. So that led to another FOIA to try to figure out how many of those things were sent out, where, and what the overall results of those cases were. And there was this whole separate thing around the process where debt collectors, private debt collectors, are paid by the city essentially to take these cases, these debt cases, through the administrative hearings process and to actually do the grunt work of calling people up, trying to get them to pay on their bills. And so that opened a whole nother area of inquiry for us, and another 2 or 3 FOIAs to try to find out information about who those folks were, when they started working with the city, how much they were being paid, and how much had they collected. They were garnishing wages, which became another. So there were things, we started with one very clear idea of what we wanted to get, that overall volume number and some more details about that. And the pot just grew and grew and grew the more and more we knew. And we used FOIA to really kind of help shine a light on all of those things. And at the end, like I said, we started with one core kind of idea or thought that we wanted to illustrate. And what we ended up doing was showing a much more comprehensive and much clearer picture, not only about overall debt, but how we got there and what were the steps that led to it. So,
I should have mentioned this. How long did the investigation take?
We started in May of last year with the thought of wrapping up the reporting at the end of August and maybe publishing in September, and we ended up publishing in November. So, and I want to say our reporting was probably done at the end of September, and then it took us a little longer because we had a lot more information, working with our data team to suss through all of that, visualize a bunch of things, and then working through the copy, fact checking. And we also translated the story. And so all of that, so we weren't able to publish until November. So all in all, it took about 6 months to put it all together.
It's an incredible story. And I think 2 incredible stories on this panel center on the humanity of it, the humanity of your sources, the people, right? It's not just data. Diane and Alden too, if you could both, working with FOIA during the pandemic is one thing, but how is it working with your sources to help tell their story? For both of you.
Well, yeah, well, for me, if you look at the story, the main photo, Cesar, I saw him on those Food Networks and Guy Fieri. He went to his restaurant and his food is delicious. And so when I went in, he was one of the many that I interviewed, but when I went in, it was like an empty shop and he had really deteriorating health, and his daughter was sitting with us, and actually when I walked in, long story short, we kind of broke bread together, and he invited me and offered me delicious Peruvian food. And it was it was not just a story for me to report on and then leave. It was really a story that I kept connection with these community members and these immigrant entrepreneurs and business owners, because this is a really human story and they really wanted their voices to be heard. This wasn't something that is normal that's going on. I mean, when he was telling me about his bills and how he is suffering financially, at that time, he was telling me about, because he's been in the business for over 20 years there. And so he was telling me how this person died, how this person was, hurt. This person closed down his business, pointing in the neighborhood. And so, yes, it was about data, but that data again, saying this for the second time, it guided me to those human stories, and it was very eye-opening. And I think, yeah, there's many more stories out there that FOIA could help. And that's the beauty of FOIA. It develops these. You're kind of in charge with what story you produce.
Only with your answer, we actually have a question for you from Leslie. With your answer, can you also answer how difficult was it to file a request and get residents' information, considering there were tens of thousands of people impacted by the water debt? And a follow-up is, to get these important voices within the store. And then after that, we'll finish off tips for each of us for an epidemic.
Sure. Well, to Leslie's question, and great to see Leslie out there. Maria had been, she pretty much had crafted water, and water access is kind of like its own kind of beat for her. And from the investigation she did about water shutoffs, she'd made a lot of contacts in essentially the water rights advocacy community. And so those were folks who were had been in contact with a number of people who were having issues around staying on top of the water bills. And so she had a number of outlets who were able to kind of point her to people. Maria also did a fair amount of knocking on doors, and the data was showing where people had trouble. And so Inglewood was one of the neighborhoods where a number of people had the water shut off, and where a number of people were suffering very high volume of water debt. And Maria spent a fair amount of time knocking on doors in the Inglewood neighborhood, and came across a number of sources in both the investigations she did around water, just by happening upon people, as the data was pointing to. One of the other things I would say is that while the data was telling us a lot about volume, Maria spent an awful lot of time with Sylvia Taylor and with Carla Pageant and some other folks, visiting their homes, hearing them talk through things, having them pull out the bills, and so there's texture, because they're as they're kind of recounting everything, they're also looking through these bills, and so the numbers are there, and everything is very vivid and coming back for them. For the previous water investigation, she had one of the women that she'd met, another Inglewood resident, kind of walk her through how she was living without water, kind of taking it step by step. And that was a part of the story that we ended up going with. So, it's an investment in time and getting that data, sussing through it and figuring out what it's telling you. But there's also, just the traditional, shoe leather that also has to be done to kind of bring those numbers to life. Those numbers are illustrative of something that's happening, but it's the human voices and their experiences, their memories, their thoughts, their hopes, their fears, all of that stuff that you also have to capture to really kind of help put meat on the bones. Sometimes those numbers can feel very static, very lifeless in a way, even if they shock you. But it's the human experience, and capturing that through conversations with people is what ultimately helps bolster those numbers to mean more than just some kind of passionless, lifeless figure. So.
Mm-hmm. That's beautifully said, because that was going to be included within my tips. First one is join existing communities where they're at, where they meet at, where they congregate. These are the people that will lead you to the data and information that you need, and probably more importantly, information that you didn't know you don't need. Another tip for me to start off the tips for the end of this workshop is get to know your FOIA officers. I did that religiously with the town of Cicero, but also the different departments that I was in contact with. Try to get to know them, try to get them on the phone, try to get them on the first name basis so they can help point you in the right direction. And like the third and final thing is back it up, peace and clarity. Surrounding yourself with data with these important topics, it could be very strenuous and stressful. So it's important to step away from time to time. So first and foremost, get to know your community that you're investigating or looking into. Allow them to help you, and you help them navigate, trying to lead into the information that you may need. Second is get to know your FOIAs officers, and third, just peace. Try to handle this very stressful way of life the best you can. But Dan, I'll start with you. Any last tips for the awesome, badass FOIA Fest attendees?
Well, always, I think Alden mentioned this earlier, but question what you have. Don't just FOIA one or two things and then rely on that one batch. Like, investigate it as well. Check it out. Ask a lot of questions. Second, organize. I mean, we're all like involved with our computers religiously. Don't just save, a little tip for me, don't save the FOIA files just on your desktop. Like, save it on a drive where it's permanent, because I've had instances where my computer overheated and I lost a few files and I panicked, but it was in my drive, thankfully. And so, and third, just, organize yourself and take your time with coding that data. That's what I have to say.
Nice, thank you.
Just to add to that, I would say really use the law, use the FOIA. There are a ton of government agencies. More than we can count, and if you really think about it, that are collecting information, storing information, and literally, as you're approaching any story, just really spending some time and thinking through what's out there, or what conceivably is out there. Just thinking about the ways in which whatever phenomenon you're trying to report on has a connection in some form or way with government. Even if it's not something that's regulated by government, but what about it might be documented or may come in contact in some form or fashion, whether it's police, whether it's the recorder of deeds, whether it's the fire department, the city finance department. The finance department was huge for this story on water debt. People owed money to the city. When they make those payments, they make them to the finance department. Or when they're behind, it's the finance department that's sending a reminder saying, hey, you're behind on this, you're behind on that. And so it may not have been intuitive, thinking that, hey, they're getting this water bill from the water department, so let's get all the FOIAs to the water department. Some of the most important stuff that we got came from the finance department. So just thinking through whatever it is you're looking at and thinking, okay, where can I get some information that could be helpful? Get a FOIA out there. Spend some time, as Jesus said, get to know your FOIA officers. You want to have a relationship with them, even if you're driving them crazy on some level. But they can also be helpful in giving you a sense of what information is actually being collected. And there's some stuff that's collected that we don't have any idea about it until we're actually asking and getting a sense of it. So, but use the FOIA. It's there to be a resource for you, and it can be incredibly potent. If it's used well, but you have to fire those FOIAs off in order to do that.
Beautifully said. Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. You could have been anywhere else in the world, but you're here with us, and we love you for it. In the chat are links to our Twitter. Please hit us up, and vice versa. It could be if you're next time doom scrolling, or you have a funny meme to share, or talk about the awesome stuff we talked about during our panel. Let us know. Otherwise, thank you guys so much. It was really great getting a chance to meet and talk with y'all and pick your brains about your awesome projects.
Likewise, I learned a lot from you both, and it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Great to be here. Great to see the work that you guys are doing. And Jesus, Cicero is a great town, man. You can have a lot of fun out there. So I'll be looking for your stuff, man.
Yeah, yes. Well, salute everybody. You have a great, safe weekend. Try to enjoy it. Thank y'all.
Bye.
Take care.